Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergasters, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible, I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. To accomplish that goal, I suggest gear that allows for high damage and the necessary defense or support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. Today's class of choice is the warrior and the elite specialization is the Bladesworn. We're gonna talk about two different builds, an open world roaming build and a power DPS variant. But before we dive into the details, let's talk some pros and cons. If you decide to play Bladesworn, you get probably the craziest burst potential in terms of damage in the game. But not only that, the build also has great sustained damage with around 35k on the column with an easy rotation. Furthermore, the build brings some nice passive utility through passive quickness and might sharing. It further brings insane self-healing if you decide to use Might Makes Right. The major downside of Bladesworn is the limited mobility. It's more difficult to use in non-stationary fights for that reason. That limited mobility is tied to the reliance on Dragon Slash. If you cannot use Dragon Slash, you have very low damage. So you want to one-slash stuff to death? You've come to the right place. Today I'll do a little update on Bladesworn. As a starting point, let's do a quick breakdown of the general playstyle. First off, as a Bladesworn you get access to the Gunsaber, an additional weapon. The Gunsaber is a weapon that has quite a few explosions built into its kit, which will be important later, so remember that. In summary, this does boom boom. As a trade-off, you lose the ability to weapon swap. Generally, Bladesworn centers around ammo skills and its trait grant a whole bunch of benefits upon using them, like increased damage for a period of time. I'm a big fan of ammo skills since they allow you to use utilities more often and synergize very well with the Bladesworn kit. The core warrior mechanic Adrenaline that builds up when you hit stuff is changed into flow on Bladesworn. It works in a similar way, but it does not build up when you attack enemies. Instead, it is generated at a base rate when in combat, which can be increased by stacking up positive flow. Additionally, some skills and traits that generate a flat amount of adrenaline are also changed into giving a flat amount of flow instead. But what are we gonna do with all the flow that we're accumulating? We're gonna be using Dragon Trigger as soon as possible. This is responsible for the vast majority of your damage and CC/healing, so you do not want to delay this unless mechanics force you to. Once you pass a certain flow threshold, you'll be able to activate Dragon Trigger. Once you do, stop moving. I know that's hard, I had to painfully learn not to button mash movement keys on this. Moving, dodging, getting CC'd or pressing a utility skill with a cast time will end Dragon Trigger and put it on cooldown. Once you enter Dragon Trigger, you'll see bullets stacking up above your weapon skills at the cost of flow. Once you reach 10 bullets, activate one of the first 3 skills to use all the bullets for Dragon Slash. The more bullets you use, the more damage you deal. Some other side effects like the stun on it with Unyielding Dragon will also scale per bullet. You have 3 different Dragon Slashes. Skill number 1 is the melee variant, Slash, Force. This does by far the highest damage but has a rather short range. This requires careful planning because once you enter Dragon Trigger you won't be able to move for a few seconds until your charges are full. The second slash is Boost. This is a dash. You should only use this when you notice that your positioning isn't ideal to move into melee range again, but even then you have other ways to move in Dragon Trigger. Skill number 3 is the ranged slash, Reach. This again does less damage than both the other slashes, around half the damage of the melee slash, but it allows you to stay at range. Only use this whenever the other 2 aren't suitable, so any time where you cannot go into melee because it's dangerous. Aside from the 3 Dragon Slashes, you have 2 additional ammo skills in Dragon Trigger, Trigger Guard and Flicker Step. These are meant to help you circumvent one of the restrictions in Dragon Trigger every once in a while. Trigger Guard grants you Aegis, so it allows you to block the next attack. This can be helpful since you're often exposed to hits you certainly don't want to take because you cannot dodge in Dragon Trigger. Flicker Step, skill number 5, is the only option to actually move yourself since it's a shadow step. Both of these skills don't have cast time, so you can use them without issues in Dragon Trigger. Let's move on to weapon and gunsaber skills. We'll be using an axe and a pistol, the weapon that comes with Bladesworn. The axe skills are all pretty straightforward. They all deal good damage and have neat side effects, aside from the auto attack that does basic damage. Axe 2 grants you Fury, and Axe 3 is an ammo skill that has a built-in execute amplifier, so it gets way more powerful on targets with lower health. The 2 pistol skills synergize very well with the ammo trait since Pistol 5 has a fast recharging ammo count and stacks up to 6 of them. It does a lot of damage for each ammo stack you have, which is why you want to prioritize it once you swap to Axe and Pistol. Pistol 4 gives you Aegis, like all skill 4s, remember that, and recharges 3 stacks of Pistol 5. That's why you always want to use pistol 5 first, then pistol 4 and another pistol 5. This combo covers a lot of the charges for the Fierce as fire buff, so it gives you passive damage too. Aside from the auto attack chain, the gun saber skills are all ammo skills. Since the recent wave of changes and buffs to them, they've also had some of the damage transferred to range damage, which is quite handy. At the time of making this video though, they do feel a little bit clunky and slow at times. The gun saber auto attack chain is very basic. The final hit of it is an explosion, but we'll rarely ever use it. Instead, we'll spend charges on the other gun saber skills. Gun saber 2 is blooming fire. This is great to keep the trait Guns and Glory up, which gives you ferocity whenever you hit an enemy with an explosion. This skill has 3 explosions and thus gives you 9 seconds of the buff. Gun saber 3 is artillery slash. This is a CC skill that you can save for situations where you need it. In all other situations you can wait until this has 3 charges, since they are all spent in one cast. Like pistol 5, this becomes more powerful with more charges spent, so it's best to wait until you have 3 charges. Gun saber 4 Cyclone Trigger gives you Aegis and does good damage. It also blocks projectiles for a little bit of time, which can be handy in some situations. Finally, we have Break Step, Gun saber 5. This is a charge ability that also grants Fury, so we can use it to cover some ground whenever that is needed. It's also a leap finisher that can be used inside combo fields. Okay, moving on to utility skills. As the healing skill, I always use To the Limit in group content. It's a shout skill that grants flow for 15 seconds upon activation and heals you for a large amount of health. It will also grant nearby allies a free dodge, so that's nice to have as well. In group content you can precast this for good flow generation in the opener of a fight. In open world, Defiance stance is too good not to use it. It absorbs all hits for 4 seconds and heals you for the damage you would have taken, making you basically immortal for its duration. Whenever you get low on health, use this. As the elite, I always use Tactical Reload. It will give you an additional charge on all your Bladesworn ammo skills. It affects basically all ammo skills we have aside from Axe 3. It is especially useful for skills with long count recharges such as Trigger Guard, Flow Stabilizer and Flicker Step. It will also make your next Dragon Trigger charge twice as fast, which is another really nice damage gain and allows you to burst quite fast, since you need less flow to charge up the first Dragon Trigger in combat. I also always use Flow Stabilizer and the Signet of Fury. In group content I always run the Signet of Might for passive damage. In open world I usually replace the Signet of Might with 4 Great Justice. When combined, Flow Stabilizer and 4 Great Justice will give you permanent Fury, additional Might and a lot more incoming flow. If you feel like you need a stun break and a condition cleanse, you can also slot Shake It Off. This has a rather short cooldown and does both. I chose these utility skills for a reason. All of them do not interrupt Dragon Trigger. And the fewer skills you have interrupting Dragon Trigger, the more reliable it becomes. If you really need additional CC, you can also slot Bull's Charge, but it's usually not needed. Compared to the benchmark rotation, the utility skill choices I made here simplify rotation quite a bit at the cost of around 10% damage. The Signets don't add to complexity since we won't activate them, and Flow Stabilizer and 4 Great Justice can just be used on cooldown. Before we move to gear and consumables, a few basic remarks. Remember that all 3 skills in slot number 4 give you Aegis, which you can always use to block incoming attacks. You also gain stability when entering Dragon Trigger, allowing you to temporarily ignore incoming CC. Now, the gear on Bladesworn is pretty straightforward. We'll be using Berserker with Scholar runes. Since Warrior doesn't have as much crit chance natively compared to other classes, we're using Accuracy Sigil instead of the standard Impact Sigil, paired with a Sigil of Force. Also, we mixed in a few Assassin's pieces so that we reached 75% crit chance unbuffed. To get there with Ascended gear, using an Ascended Assassin's Amulet and a backpack is enough to reach 75%. With Exotic gear, you'll have to use more pieces of Assassins. Keep in mind that the benchmark build runs different gear. There are, however, different gear variants for it too, with small DPS differences between them, so running Scholar is fine even if you go for the benchmark. In terms of survivability, all survivability you might need comes from trait swaps, as I'll explain in a second. In terms of consumables, we'll always be using power and ferocity food. If you want additional survivability in open world, you can also use the fried golden dumpling for even more might generation and thus self-healing. The utility item should always be a potent superior sharpening stone or any equivalent to it. If you can afford it, you can also use a writ of masterful strength or ascended food, of course. Alright, traits and specializations. This is also pretty straightforward since we'll always be using strength and tactics and Bladesworn. For the DPS build in strength, we'll be using all the juicy damage buffs we can get. 5% increased strike damage and an additional 10% for 6 seconds upon using a physical skill, converting power to both vitality and ferocity, and finally up to 21% increased damage upon spending charges for Dragon Slash. Strength will also make your dodges apply might and damage enemies, make burst skills restore endurance on hit, and have might grant more power to you. It will further increase your crit chance by 5%, which is very valuable. In open world we'll be swapping to both Forceful Greatsword and Might Makes Right. This costs you a good chunk of damage, but these traits will cause you to have a very high endurance recovery and sustain, as well as good might generation for yourself. With Might Makes Right, each stack of might you apply to yourself heals you. You can really make yourself immortal with this, especially when paired with all the sources of ages you have. The bonuses on Forceful Greatsword are doubled while wielding a greatsword. That, however, is not even needed to survive even harder encounters on your own. In any case, we'll pair Strength with Tactics. Tactics adds a lot of utility and survivability to your kit, while being insane burst damage in groups. It grants 10% increased damage versus movement and bird enemies, 1% damage for every boon on you, 25% more damage against targets above 80% health, as well as sharing 2 seconds of quickness with allies whenever you hit with Dragon Trigger. With Tactics, you can burst down a lot of enemies in one go with Dragon Trigger, because the 25% damage increase applies on Dragon Trigger even if you deal more than 25% of the enemy's health in a single hit. It will further heal you whenever you apply Might to allies, including yourself. Together with Might Makes Right, this heals you for 200 health per Might stack you apply to yourself, which is crazy. Now, if you want to be immortal in group content or simply share some Might instead of quickness, you can run Phalanx Strength. Phalanx Strength, when paired with all the might sources you have, makes you pretty much immortal when you're not alone, since any might you apply to yourself will apply to allies and heal you for 70 health per person that it gets shared with. This adds up to an insane amount of healing. Finally, we are of course using Bladesworn. Default traits of choice simply maximize the damage and CC output as well as might generation. You'll deal 1% increased damage for every ammo skill you use, as well as gain 250 ferocity for 3 seconds upon hitting an enemy with an explosion. We use lots of ammo skills and we use lots of explosions, so these traits should be up most of the time. Finally, you will damage enemies and gain flow on weapon swap. In open world it's often better to run River's Flow for 10% increased incoming healing, since that'll also apply to Might Makes Right and Mending Might, and is much better than actually investing into healing power due to the small scaling coefficients of these effects. As I said before, you'll also gain stability whenever you enter Dragon Trigger, which is nice to have as well. The Grandmaster trait should always be Unyielding Dragon. It adds a lot of CC to your Dragon Slashes and also makes you gain might while converting flow into charges, passively healing you while you are in Dragon Trigger. It also makes Dragon Slash Ignore Blind, which can be useful in quite a few situations. Alright, in the final part of the video let's talk about the rotation. It centers around supplying a very straightforward way to maintain the essential buffs as good as possible, so Fierce as Fire as well as Guns and Glory. For the opener, you can precast all charges of Gunsaber 3, 4 and 5 to build up stacks of Fierce as Fire. Then use To the Limit, Flow Stabilizer and Tactical Reload. Then you can use another 2 stacks of Flow Stabilizer. Flow Stabilizer should be used on cooldown at all times to maintain a good flow rate. Tactical Reload should also be used on cooldown to recharge ammo stacks and speed up the charge on the next Dragon Trigger. Then enter Dragon Trigger, wait for all charges to fill and cast Dragon Slash Force. Always use Force if possible, the other 2 are only for emergencies. You can use Trigger Guard and Flicker Step charges for Fierce as Fire coverage, but it's often better to save them for situations where you might need a bit of mobility or blocks in Dragon Trigger. After leaving Dragon Trigger, you will always be in Gunsaber. Then, in any case, use Gunsaber 2. From here onwards, there are 2 different paths to take. If you can swap to Axe and Pistol after Gunsaber 2, do so as soon as possible. In that case, use Pistol 5 first, then Pistol 4. Use Pistol 5 another time, and after that just use the 2 Axe skills on cooldown and fill gaps with auto attacks. If you cannot swap to Axe and Pistol after Gunsaber 2, stay on Gunsaber and use Gunsaber 2 to 4 on cooldown. Make sure to have at least 2 stacks on Gunsaber 3 if you use it, because otherwise using an auto attack is simply stronger. Generally, you will alternate between the 2 rotation paths. Simply check whether swapping to Axe and Pistol is available shortly after Gunsaber 2 and you're good to go. Never delay Dragon Trigger unless bosses have invulnerability phases. In those cases, you can charge up Dragon Trigger and wait for the phase to end to use it immediately after. In case you need crowd control, you can save Gunsaber 3, slot Bolt's Charge instead of Signet of Might, or use Dragon Trigger. In cases where bosses have invulnerability phases where CC is needed, so like Samurok, try to avoid using Dragon Trigger for it because it wastes a large amount of your damage. If allies would die otherwise, of course, use Dragon Trigger to save them. Alright, That is it for today. I hope this video was insightful for you and made you want to try Bladesworn. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. See you next time and happy slashing.